Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends program. I'm interviewing Dr. Francis J. Reichman. That's Reichman. Two N's. Mann. Give me your address, please.
Northwest 15th Street, Oklahoma City. 124 Northwest 15th.
Dr. Reichman is being interviewed on his experiences with the 45th Infantry Division, which he served for many years before World War II and during World War II. Following World War II, he became a reserve brigadier general and was assistant division commander of the 95th Infantry Division, which is a reserve division based largely in the state of Oklahoma, but also in Arkansas and Louisiana. Dr. Reichman, we will talk about the early days first of the 45th Division and your association. You entered the division at what time?
I entered the division about 1926 in Oklahoma City. I think it's of interest to know why. I was an artilleryman in World War I. And one day, after World War I went to school at the University of Michigan and had no part in reserve training of any kind. And after World War I, in 26, General Barrett, Adjutant General of Oklahoma, called me on the phone and asked me if I would be interested in taking an examination as a candidate for second lieutenant in the Oklahoma National Guard. Well, he talked me into it, and so I went out and took the examination with 3 or 4 other candidates. And while I had never studied anything military in about 5 or 6 years, I was selected as second lieutenant in the 160th Field Artillery of the Oklahoma National Guard. I believe it was my age and past experience rather than the questions I answered during the examination, but nevertheless, I took the commission in the headquarters battery of the 2nd Battalion of the 160th, and we just went on from there.
General Reichman, we younger people in the 45th have heard a lot about General Barrett. We know he was around a long time. I wonder if you'll tell us a little bit about him.
General Barrett had been Adjutant General of the state of Oklahoma for I don't know how many years. He was very elderly. He never could pass physical examination for active duty during World War I, but he was a great organizer, and he succeeded in organizing the 45th Division about 1923, commanded by General Markham. I got in a little late, and when I was in the 70th Field Artillery Brigade, the 2nd Battalion headquarters later became the headquarters of the 70th Field Artillery Brigade, and so I happened to be appointed as communications officer of the 70th Field Artillery Brigade under General William S. Key. And that really started my career because nobody instilled more incentive to try to become a good soldier and officer than General Key and his 3 regimental commanders. There was Colonel Walmsley and no, I'm sorry. The other 2, let me wait a minute. Cut it. And Colonel Holden, who commanded the 160th Field Artillery, did a great deal to help me become an officer in the true sense of the word. After some time, General Key became the division commander of the 45th Infantry Division, and I was fortunate enough to have him ask me to become a part of the division staff. In that capacity, I became G3 about in June. We were called out on 1 year's active duty in the fall, and here I was, a G3 of a division with a very acute training problem. We were supposed to be trained and ready for combat in 16 weeks. We had no training programs from the authorities in Washington except that for the engineers. We were changed from a square division to a triangular division, and many of our fine officers and men and one almost complete infantry regiment and battalion of artillery were transferred out of the division. Together with this, General McNair came down from Washington with his staff to tell us of the acuteness of the situation, and it looked like we were going to be in war in a very short time, and that we would probably have to go to the Pacific Theater, and we would not possibly we would not have time to even complete the 16-week training program. With this, the G3 asked me what we needed to do the very best we could with this training. I said, we need the 16-week training program for all units, not just for the engineers. He said he was sorry they just didn't have them. So we had to do the best we could. Well, we struggled along and did the best we could. The tentative training program that we had to design from this engineer battalion's training program called for all known range firing to be completed in 6 weeks, I believe it was. We had a 36 target range. The program from Leavenworth called for 40 targets, and how we could do it in the allotted time was our big problem. In the meantime, officers were called upon to go to school in various places like Fort Benning and Leavenworth, and Colonel Kinney, who was G4, and myself were nominated to go to Leavenworth. Then the question came, and General Key asked me, who would you recommend to take your place as G3 with this training so acute? Well, shortly after we were called out, some very fine instructor officers were sent back to their states and taken away from us. Notably, there was Colonel Ancorn from Colorado, who was instructor for the 157th Infantry, and Colonel Church from New Mexico. I had learned to know them and respect their military knowledge during our maneuvers in Texas and Louisiana. And so I asked the general if he could possibly get Colonel Church back and Colonel Ancorn, that it would be a great help to the division. Well, he said, why? I said, I would immediately recommend that Colonel Church be made G3 and that Colonel Ancorn be made G4, since Colonel Kenny was also going away to school. Well, General Key succeeded in getting them back. And within 4 or 5 days, they were with us, and Colonel Church came in as my assistant. And I outlined some of our problems that I knew. And he just got up on a high stool with a big drawing board and maps in front of him, and he worked day and night to work out a training program, a 36 target range, a very short time to do the work and get the training done. And it was practically winter time. It was December. The days were short, but he worked it out by training every day and Sunday, starting at daylight, and training until dark, and firing on the known ranges and other ranges until dark. The units that were going to fire the next day would bivouac at the firing sites, and they would start just as soon as there was enough daylight to see the sights on their rifles. We went back to Leavenworth. I took the G3 course, and in due time came back to the division. General Key called me in, and he hemmed and hawed. He was very apologetic. He saw the wonderful work that Colonel Ancorn and General Church, or then Colonel Church, had been doing, and he said, Doc, he always called me Doc, he said, I hate to tell you this, but I really think, I said, stop, General, I know what you mean. I said, Colonel Church is a wonderful military man, and he is a wonderful G3, or could be anything else as far as that goes. I said, I know you would like to have Colonel Church become G3 of the division. And I said, that is all right with me. And then General Key said, well, I'm awful glad to hear you say that. He said, now, if you want to be G4 or G2, you can have either one of them. So I accepted the G2, since our G2 was a bit over age and was going to have to be transferred. That was Colonel Harrison. And so with G3 training, with G3 at Leavenworth, I became G2 of the 45th Infantry Division. And I had to start all over again from there. But that's the Army.
Let's go back. That's great. Let's go back to a little bit to the period now preceding World War II. I wonder if you would tell me some of the highlights, what you feel are the highlights prior to the building of the national emergency.
Meaning, just exactly.
General Reichman, why don't you tell us something about the early day summer camps of your artillery?
I was with the 160th Field Artillery. We had about half our necessary number of horses for training at our home stations, and of course our equipment. We were equipped with French 75 millimeter artillery pieces and World War I communications equipment, such as reels for laying wire and things of that kind, all horse-drawn. We moved to Fort Sill from various parts of the state by train. That included loading our equipment on flat cars, tying them down, and loading our horses into cattle cars, and away we'd go to Fort Sill at about 20 miles an hour from various parts of the state. We had rations which consisted of canned tomatoes and hardtack to eat on the way. On arrival at Fort Sill, our unloading, which was a new experience for the battery I was in because it was a new battery, and some of the others gave us some help, and we soon learned to unload our heavy pieces and guns and the horses in what we considered pretty good time. The regular officers from the post and from the field artillery school used to come down and watch us. And I thought myself that they were watching to see how naive it could be done. But in 1932, when I took the Field Artillery Battery Officers course, and the commanding general gave us a talk on troop movement, he said, the only real training in troop movement that we are able to even observe on this post for our officers and men is to watch the 45th Division unload. He said, that is an education for us. And I think that, quoting the general, that they do a remarkable job. He said, when you move a regular Army artillery unit from one post to another, they turn in their equipment at the post they're moving away from. They move to the new post, for instance, at Camp Lewis up in Washington State, and they draw the equipment up there. They never have the experience that we can see when we watch the Oklahoma National Guard come in here and unload. I think that is something that should be noted. Now, the same thing when we moved overland to maneuvers, to Louisiana, to South Texas, and while we later became motorized, we had the same problems with some of our equipment, loading and unloading. That is something that is not done today because we have so many trucks and heavy tractors to move our artillery pieces and so on. Which reminds me of the maneuvers in Texas and Louisiana under the direction of our Corps Commander, General Kruger. General Kruger was a wonderful teacher, and on maneuvers both at Abilene and Fort Sill and down in Texas, he gave us so much intimate instruction, and the more instruction he thought you could absorb, the more he poured it on you. I'll never forget the many times when he sat in my G2 tent, sometimes all night long, just chastising me and interrogating me and trying to get me to make a mistake, and if I did make a mistake, he would just smile and say, well, next time you'll do better. This is the way I would recommend. He was the greatest inspector of kitchens we ever had. He believed in perfect sanitation, and he taught the 45th Infantry Division more plain, common, ordinary horse sense about how to act, how to take care of ourselves and our men and our equipment that did us more good in combat and in the entire future than any one I can think of. I'll never forget the time when Major Preston J.C. Murphy, who is a retired colonel and who commanded an infantry regiment, the 179th in combat later on, was my assistant, and he had to go to Fort Benning to school. And so it was up to the division commander, who was still General William S. Key, to get me an assistant. And Colonel Styron, afterwards a Major General, who was Chief of Staff, called me on the phone and says, "We want you to make our recommendations for the position of your assistant." And I said, "Well, let me think about it a day or two," which he did, but he said, "We've got a list." I said, "I don't want the list, I just want to think about it." So I called him the next day and I said, "I want Captain Doherty, Captain Fred Doherty." "Oh," he said, you don't want that young fella. He's just a captain. There's a whole list of majors that want that job." I said, "I don't care. I want Captain Doherty." And he said, "Well, I'll speak to the general about it." And so that was the end of that conversation. The next day he called me and he said, I'm sorry to tell you, you can't have Captain Doherty." "Well," I said, "may I speak to the general personally about that?" "Well," he said, "sure you may, but it won't do any good." Well, I said, "Why not?" "Well," he said, "General Kruger selected him to go with him in his new Army headquarters staff." Well, that was a good chuckle, all right. I hated to lose Captain Doherty, but my judgment was vindicated, and it's been vindicated hundreds of times since then. That's all of that.
General Reichman, you mentioned one occasion prior to World War II when you were called out, I believe, on a fire. Could you tell me about this situation and about what year it was?
That was a situation along the...
Start over telling what it was instead of an answer.
Oh.
Would be cut out.
There was an oil well dump fire, really. The residue oil caught a fire adjacent to the Rock Island tracks in southeast Oklahoma City, right close to the business district. This oil well fire was not under control, and there were several tank cars along the Rock Island track that were being threatened by this fire. Some of them perhaps were empty, but even then the residue oil might cause an explosion. So the battery that I was with at the time, I think I was a first lieutenant, were called out. Our horses were at the old fairgrounds, which was not very far, really, from where the fire was. So we got our few horses out, and we had orders to clear the population right next to the fire, just to the north of the fire, and the wind was from the south, out of the entire area. This was a slum section, and there were a large number of families and children in there, practically all colored people. So we mounted up and proceeded to go down through there and get these people to move out. Well, they did. Maybe we were too vigorous, but the fire was raging, and the railroad company had not been able to move the cars away from the danger area at that time. And They were well disciplined and nice, but they started running, and looked a little bit panicky. But they were coming out in essentially good order. I didn't think too much about it until I got clippings from some of my friends up in Michigan and other places, big headlines in the northeastern papers about the cavalry being called out and there being a riot, and it looked like so many people were threatened to be killed or maimed by this tremendous fire in Oklahoma City. Well, after a few hours, the fire was put out, the tank cars were moved, and everything was quiet. But these newspaper articles made me mention this particular incident because we didn't have cavalry. We had about 8 or 10 horses, and there was really some reporter who got a few lines over the telegraph, perhaps, and made a terrific story out of it.
General Reichman, why don't you tell me a little bit about your experiences as a G2 during World War II, and particularly in the combat area, including possibly some of the intelligence situations that you and the division faced during the war?
It is, of course, very interesting to be a Division G2 in any active combat situation. In fact, you, as G2, represent the enemy, and in some situations, you are treated by your own friends and your own staff as the enemy, because naturally you have to assume the dark side of the cloud all the time. You have to try to figure out, I won't say by imagination, but by logic, with the information you have, what the enemy can do, not what he will do. And that is a very difficult thing. I recall on NCO when, according to Army orders, and not only Army, but the orders from the British theater commander, was to attack, and attack, when it was quite obvious to the Corps G2 and to myself, Colonel Angevin was Corps G2 at the time, that what we should have been doing was to dig in and prepare to resist attack, because here we were with two partially organized British divisions, and the 3rd Division and ourselves, opposed by 7 known German divisions up on the hills around us. And that was a difficult time, because you could report only to your division commander that we should be digging in. We should be getting as many sandbags and other equipment to reinforce our positions, to improve our firepower, to get in more ammunition. And on the other side, he would get his orders to be ready to attack. And those were terrifically difficult times for any G2. It got to the point where the Chief of Staff and the G3 wouldn't speak to me. But eventually, of course, everything came out all right. we did at the right time, just barely, get prepared to defend that beachhead. And the German commander, General Kesselring, said afterwards that his orders were to wipe us off of that beachhead by a 4-day continuous attack, 4 days and 4 nights. Well, they started out to do that. And we, fortunately, were ready. And after 3 days, General Kesselring called it off. They stopped attacking. We had, as far as I could tell on the beachhead, we had about 4 rounds per gun left. Perhaps it was 6 rounds, as I recall again, when the General Kesselring called off the attack. And he said afterwards in his memoirs, he said, the greatest defensive effort that was produced during the entire World War II was the defense of the Anzio beachhead by the Allied forces. Is that a...
That's good.
That is the best incident I know of.
Could you tell us a little about this Salerno, about your intelligence effort there?
At Salerno, General Middleton and just a portion of his staff and one
about your intelligence effort there.
At Salerno, General Middleton and just a portion of his staff and one regiment of infantry, about a regiment of half of infantry, and 2 battalions of artillery was all the landing ships we could get to move from Sicily over to Salerno. So the other part of the division was back at Salerno, in Sicily, and these landing craft would have to go back and pick them up and bring them in. So here we were. I was acting chief of staff for General Middleton. Colonel Church, who was the chief of staff, was back to hurry up and get the rest of the division up as soon as possible. So we were out in floating reserve. The Army headquarters under General Clark was on the Encon, which we had used previously in training off of Norfolk, which was really a command ship with a tremendous amount of radio equipment and so on. We were out in floating reserve. The 36th and 2 British divisions had landed, the 36th on the right and the 2 British divisions on the left, which was the north. And General Middleton was quite worried about the 36th situation. He was anxious to be able, if needed, to land his combat forces and assist the 36th Division. So he went over to see General Clark in his headquarters, and when he came back to the landing ship that I was on, and he also, he said, I've ordered a speedboat. It's going to take General Clark's chief of staff ashore, and I want you, and he named the engineer officer and the S2 of the 179th, who was on the same ship with us. I want you 3 to go ashore and go to the division command post of the 36th and find out the situation and see how they're getting along, how much enemy force is pressing on them, and then come back and report to me. Well, we did that. The speedboat came along and picked us up. The Army Chief of Staff was aboard, and we went ashore. We just had to hitch a ride to the division command post, which was in the tobacco warehouse, which is familiar to anybody who has been there. And after going up there, things were in quite a bit of confusion. The 36 was hit very heavy upon landing, particularly with German artillery, and they were quite spread out and having considerable difficulty. I sent the regimental S2 was with me and the engineers out to get the situation from the battalions who were actually in combat of the 36th Division. After we got that information, and the speedboat was to pick us up, I think it was at 6 o'clock in the evening, just at dusk, because it gets dark pretty fast when it starts that far south. So we got back and back to the shore. Our difficulty was to get aboard this speedboat. I finally induced a driver who was driving a duck, that is a large truck that's amphibious, to take us out. We could see the speedboat maneuvering back and forth, kind of looking for us. And I finally talked him into it. He was busy on another mission, but he took us out and we got on the speedboat. The Chief of Staff of the Army had not shown up. I don't know where he went or what happened to him to this day. But anyhow, he did not show up, and the Navy officer in charge of this speedboat said, well, it's getting dark awful fast, and I'll never be able to find the Ancon if we don't get going. And so we left. And we found the Ancon all right. They had moved. After dark, they had moved on account of the threat of air attacks, and they had changed their position. And we found the LST that General Middleton was on first, however, and I went aboard and reported to him, and I said, well, have somebody hold that speedboat there a few minutes. And he said, I'm going over to see General Clark, and I'll go with you, and I want you to get the maps for such and such an area. And he had it all plotted out by that time, what maps to get. So we went back aboard the Ancon, and I had to report to General Clark because the Chief of Staff had not arrived, and General Middleton spent about an hour and a half conferring with General Clark. In the meantime, I got the maps that we needed. Incidentally, it was rather difficult to get the maps because the assistant G2 was so excited, that staff having never been even close to combat before. So I had to actually physically help them select the proper maps. Finally, General Middleton came out from General Clark. He says, well, Doc, let's get going. We'll get on back to our LST, and we're going to land our combat troops just as soon as possible. So by daylight, we had started to land. And General Middleton left the very first to select an area and so on. We had the maps all distributed, and he said, "Now, Doc," he said, "you stay here until our last combat troops are landed. You watch this and see that they all get ashore regardless of any air raids or anything else." Well, there were a couple of air raids, but they didn't amount to much. And by noon, we had everything landed, and as fast as they were landed, both the infantry and the artillery were shooting. They were in combat just as fast as they came in, which was a very fortunate thing. And I had developed very deep respect for General Middleton, but never the respect that that incident generated. It was terrific.
There is no ending on this interview. The interview just ends. It is copied by Joe Todd on June 17th, 1985.